Welcome everybody to Scientists Warning Europe's event now here today. Thank you for coming. I'd like to start by thanking some of our partners that are here with us today and helped us actually get up here on the stage. So I'd like to thank We Have the Power, Sustainable Population Australia, the Interfaith Centre for Sustainable Development, the International Society for Ecological Economics, Facing Future Earth, and the Tzu Chi Foundation. I have with me two fantastic guests here today. So on my right, I have Dr. Helen Harwatt, who's from Chatham House and also Harvard Law School. I have on my right Sunniva Sorby, Arctic ice explorer and citizen scientist. Scientists Warning Europe has certainly been driving forward science-led action on the climate crisis now for a number of years, as have the great scientists' warnings that have been issued. And we're trying to make sure that our leaders focus on what's absolutely necessary to save us in this existential crisis that we're in. There have been 4 major scientists' warnings to humanity. In 1992, there was the first scientists' warning to humanity. It was issued by 1,700 scientists at the time, including a majority of the Nobel Prize winners in science. And that said, we were on a collision course with the biosphere. The second warning, issued 25 years later on, was issued by 15,500 scientists. That's the World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice. And that said that the first scientists had got it right, that we completely ignored them, that it was more urgent now, and we had to take even more action. There was then, on the 5th of November 2019, the World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency, on the same day as President Trump was announcing that America should leave the Paris Accord, and that was issued by 11,500 scientists. There is now a 4th Great Scientists Warning, which has been written. It's available to see by going to our website on planetincrisis.com, and any graduate scientist can now sign it. It should be out for publication, we hope, by the end of this week, ready before COP has finished. There'll also be a film that's coming out as well by the end of the week, which is being directed by the director of the last David Attenborough, Johan Rockström film on Netflix. Now, within all the scientists' warnings, or at least the last 3, and particularly in the most recent one, the scientists look at 6 stressors. So in those stressors, there is population, short-lived pollutants, economy, energy, nature, and food, which is where we're going to concentrate our efforts and our thoughts today. And in addition, this latest warning goes much more into leadership issues as well. So it talks about what needs to be done right from a community and sort of parish leadership level up through local authorities and counties and states, up to national leadership, and even here on COP26, because it is so essential in the very short amount of time we've got left that our leaders get across the line and do what they're meant to be there for, which is lead. Not question the science, but take a grip of the science, agree with it, understand it, and just move forward and lead. And we're all crying out for strong leadership on this issue at the moment. So I'd like to now start by turning to Dr. Helen Harwatt, here on my right, and asking for Helen really to look at some of the comments in the food section of the World Scientists Warnings into Action paper. But before I do, I'm actually going to just read a little part straight out of the paper. Current agricultural production and consumption patterns have gone well beyond planetary boundaries and cannot sustain 8 billion people. The food system generates more than 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, around 70% of freshwater use, most deforestation and nutrient runoff, leading to freshwater and coastal dead zones. That's not a very good recommendation for how we're running our food system at the moment. So Helen, I know you were reviewing the paper as well and the food systems. Maybe you can give us an idea of what the paper was saying and give us some comments on it.
Yeah, thanks, Ed, and hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. Yeah, I wasn't an author on the paper, but it certainly is very consistent with much of the research that I've been involved in. So just to begin with, I want to give some background context on why we're even concerned about food systems. So we know that there's clearly no business as usual for any sector if we're to align with 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And recent research has actually shown that food system transformation is essential for holding temperatures to 1.5 degrees. So even if we stopped burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, the ongoing emissions from the food system would actually prevent that 1.5 degree target. So we really need transformation across all sectors, including food. In terms of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, as Ed has already mentioned, they contribute currently around 25% to global greenhouse gas emissions. If we expand that to include the entire food system, that accounts for around a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions, and the livestock sector alone accounts for around 14.5% to 16.5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. The land use is a really key component in this whole climate food picture. Currently, around half of all Earth's habitable land is used for agriculture. 78% of that agricultural land is used for animal agriculture specifically. And in return, we get around 18% of global calories and around 37% of global protein for human consumption from the livestock sector. Agriculture is also the major driver of land use change currently and historically, so that includes the loss of carbon sinks from, for example, deforestation, and is also the main driver of land degradation. It's also the main driver of biodiversity loss, which is a really important component when we're thinking about climate in terms of resilience and adaptation. So one of the recommendations in the paper is to take the systems approach, which really aligns with the research that we've been doing at Chatham House as well. And this is so important because I think the temptation is to look for technological fixes, which are necessary, but certainly on their own are nowhere near enough. We also can't just look at local food as the solution. It's part of the solution, or it could be in certain contexts, but it's certainly not the only solution. And similarly, we can't just look at consumers and do kind of nudge tactics to actually try and encourage them to eat more sustainable choices. We really need to look at the entire system from start to finish. And in the article, action was identified across three main areas. So that was food production, land use, and farming practices. So in terms of production, the main recommendation is from high-impact foods to low-impact foods, and generally speaking, that means animal source foods to plant-based foods. And if we go kind of full spectrum on that, globally shifting from current diets to plant-based, that would actually reduce food emissions by around 70%. Conversely, on a current sort of business as usual trajectory, the livestock sector alone by 2030 could use around half of the emissions budget, consistent with 1.5 degrees. It's also really crucial to reduce food waste in that, which is a really key part of reducing the actual demand for food production overall. So in terms of land use, preventing further loss of carbon sinks and habitats is absolutely essential. And also on top of that is to restore huge areas of land that's already been lost, so all of those carbon sinks, for example, from deforestation. In terms of farming, we really need to reduce the impact of farming practices, and that includes things such as closed loop or circular agricultural production to reduce resource requirements, and again, technology does play a role in that as well, and also to reduce land degradation through agriculture. And just finally, the shift in production part is really the key sort of enabling factor to all of those three levers. So it's from shifting the high impact to the low impact foods where we actually free up land and we take the pressure off land being converted. So for example, further deforestation for agricultural land, and actually enable some of that spared land to be restored back to its native habitat and restore that carbon sink, but also to enable more space for nature-friendly farming. So for example, organic food production takes up more space than conventional food production.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. And I know that you've done quite a few other studies as well as helping and reviewing what was in the scientist warning paper. And one of your studies was looking at food systems and land use, particularly around the UK. Maybe you can give us an idea of what you were covering in that.
Yeah, sure. So I will cover the global analysis that we followed up the UK to, just because
Great.
we're at a global conference.
Sure.
So we published this last year in Nature Sustainability, and what we were really curious about is the carbon opportunity cost. So we know that land use is a major issue for agriculture, but also we tend to think about carbon sinks in terms of current deforestation rather than sort of historical. So we were really curious to look at the carbon opportunity cost of current agriculture. So what could that land actually sequester in terms of removing emissions from the atmosphere if it wasn't actually used for agriculture and was instead returned to its native habitat? So this is what that looks like globally. So first of all, if you just imagine all of those green areas are orange, that gives you an idea of the land use occupation of animal agriculture in this example. So that's all crop land use and all permanent pasture land use for animal agriculture globally. And then if we look back in the green form, that shows you the carbon density, or what could actually be sequestered on that land if it was no longer used for pasture and cropland, but was actually returned to its native vegetation or habitat cover, which in this case we disaggregated to grasslands and forest lands. So you can see that even areas like Ireland, for example, could be much, much greener than they currently are if that land was restored to its native vegetation cover. In that example as well, around 72% of those green areas were actually pasture and the rest was cropland. So one of the really interesting things that came out of this, and I think is really relevant when we're looking at where we take action and who's really leading on that, and particularly relevant to this restoration piece, which we tend to think is more about kind of tropical or low-income country areas, but actually our results showed that most of the potential for restoring these carbon sinks was actually in high and upper middle income countries. So combined, that was around 70% of that restoration or carbon sequestration potential from basically switching that land use back over. And I think that's really significant to bear in mind when we're looking at where that leadership could come from on these issues. So in high-income countries, around half of that restoration was between pasture and cropland, and in upper middle-income countries, about 70% of that restoration would be from pasture land to forest. So in the final example, I just want to demonstrate some of the dietary scenarios that we looked at, linking back to some of the previous comments I made. So in that first bar there, which is actually an increase in emissions, that's business as usual food production up to 2050. And we can see that would actually result in a net carbon emission to the atmosphere. So we're actually seeing more emissions under business as usual. The second column is the Eat Lancet Commission diet, which is around 70% reduction of meat consumption to current diets, and that is equivalent to around a 9 years worth of current CO2 emissions removed from the atmosphere if we shifted to that diet globally by 2050. And in that final column, if we go full spectrum to a plant-based vegan diet, that would actually extend that 9 years to 16 years worth of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And that's really a substantial amount if we think about the greenhouse gas removals that the IPCC are estimating that we need this century. So that's somewhere between 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And in total, that final vegan scenario, for example, was around 550 gigatons of CO2. So it's somewhere around 50% of that potential total carbon dioxide removal that we need this century. So really, really significant role to play for food systems in this whole picture.
Yeah, great, absolutely. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to bring in our other guest here, so Sunniva Sorby, who spent 19 months in a hut in the Arctic with a colleague and a canine companion. And we're really asking Sunniva to come here today to have a look at some of the issues there maybe related to nutrition. What was it like getting the right food and water for you all out there in the Arctic, and maybe some other anecdotes, and maybe about 5 minutes on your experience in the Arctic.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. I am, as mentioned, Sunniva Sorby, and I'm a co-founder of a project called Hearts in the Ice. And for 19 months, and we all have a very deep personal connection to food, don't we? And without it, we don't survive. And in the Arctic, it could not be a more important issue than it is today, because many people in the Arctic depend on ice and traditional weather patterns for access to food, hunting and fishing. So for 19 months, I lived in a remote trapper's cabin called Bumsaboo with my expedition partner. This is the trapper's cabin right here. And we actually demanded all of our suppliers to not package our food in lots of plastic, and to actually make sure that everything we had was sustainable. And I have to tell you, this was nearly impossible. So before we left for Bumsaboo, Hilde, who is here, and myself made sure we brought sustainably caught food. So there was sustainably caught salmon and cod before we left. In addition, because we were up in Svalbard, it is legal to hunt there for reindeer, Svalbard reindeer, a very lean, grass-fed reindeer. And so hunted a reindeer before we left, and we were able to actually eat that during our expedition. Food was absolutely a priority for us, because we had no access to a resupply for the entire 9 months, the first 9 months that we were there. So this meant making sure that we took care of every single thing we brought in. And that meant not throwing anything away. So food waste was actually impossible. And this is something that is a really strong message that I'd like to share out there, is we Westerners waste way too much food. We have access to a lot of food, and we waste a lot of it. And many countries have no opportunity to actually even access the kind of food we do. So we saved our food down to the single last limp little carrot. And we treasured that little carrot, and we celebrated it, and we blessed it, and had a really nice meal around all of that. And I will advance that, just one little thing here. We brought in all of our food for 9 months, as I mentioned. We had to rotate it, and we learned lessons from the early trappers up in Svalbard. And that meant making sure that you take care of what you have. We had no refrigerator, so we had to make sure we rotated all of our eggs, and we learned from Helfrid Neus, who rotated eggs to make sure, the yolk doesn't stick to the eggshell. And our eggs lasted 7 months. And so never trust the labels that are written on the best buy date on your food. We have to calibrate what that represents. I'll end with a little story about our 4-year-old furry friend up here, Etra, who on the week before we were leaving Bumsaboo, we heard a bark. And the only time we hear her bark is when there's a polar bear outside. We had 100 polar bear encounters, and we open up the door, and the polar bear is there eating Etra's food. Not a good thing. So we had to scare the polar bear away, and we were able to save the last little morsels for our 4-legged friends. So we must covet and safely secure and rotate and store and not waste food, because that is something that few people have access to that we do.
Right. Absolutely. Yes, thank you for that. So Helen, just as a comment, we had very recently the director of Seaspiracy with us, actually, talking about fish and talking about he'd been criticized online by a certain number of people, saying that he couldn't be saying to everybody, stop eating fish, because there were some communities that depended on it, so around the world. I just wonder, in terms of when we're talking about stopping eating meat, which we know is a great way to reduce carbon emissions, as well as quite a number of other environmental impacts, is there some communities around the world where that wouldn't be possible, and it would be almost like required that they would keep eating meat?
Well, I think just physiologically, there's no requirement for animal products. But in terms of practicality, the way that some systems are currently set up, there is some dependency in certain places. So I think, again, it's more about transitioning or developing those systems in a way that actually aligns with planetary health goals. rather than seeing anything as a kind of concrete barrier, actually aligning that with the planetary health goals, I think, is the key thing. But in terms of consumption, obviously, high-income countries are really the huge kind of hotspot in terms of animal product consumption, for example. So if we're looking at reductions, then really the onus is on high-income and now more middle-income countries to actually shift that consumption.
Absolutely. And if we're looking in those countries, what about advice we should be giving both to individuals, but also taking into account that the paper was looking at leaders at different levels of action, and particularly now going down at the more grassroots levels, so community leaders, parish leaders, or smaller town leaders. What can the individuals and leaders at that community level do in relation to this?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot, but I mean, first of all, I just want to say that we absolutely need action at the national level. So we can't just sort of pass this over to communities or kind of subnational actors. We really need the national level action, because that's where we really could see substantial changes like subsidy restructuring and different incentive schemes being implemented. And when we think about transitioning, we really need that kind of alternative livelihood piece in there to come at the national level, and also for dietary guidelines as well to really align with the sustainability aspect of food systems. So there's a huge role for national, but you're absolutely right, there is roles for subnational as well. And I think one of the really promising things is around sustainable procurement. So if we think about sustainable procurement targets, whether that's in schools, hospitals, other kind of local council facilities, I think there's a huge potential. And one recent example is Oslo City, where they've set a really ambitious and near-term target for meat reduction. So they're going for a 50% reduction by 2023. And a 50% reduction in food waste by 2030. So that's just one example of a really kind of progressive, but aligning with the action that's needed, really. They shouldn't be standing out as a sort of, they're really ahead of the curve. This is just the kind of action that is needed. So that's one example. And I think when we think about the land use change, there's probably things that can be done at the local level as well, depending on who has the sort of jurisdiction over land use in certain areas. And I guess that's going to vary by country and even probably by local councils in the UK as well. But there's also quite a lot that individuals can do. And again, this isn't to say that we just focus on individuals, but as everyone kind of having a role, we can purchase products that align with planetary health goals, and in doing that send important signals to the market to actually help to shift production from that side as well. And also the obvious one is to contact our political representatives, which you will know far more about than me.
Certainly, yeah, sure. Now, maybe comment on that in another session, I should think, actually. In addition, we had Tim Jackson here, and we were talking about the targets that we should be going to. We have this currently politically negotiated target of 2050 that we keep trying to shoehorn all the science into to get us there, and it becomes increasingly difficult as we don't actually do anything with our NDCs and we don't follow our NDCs. And Tim was espousing the target for net zero of 2030. And when we talked about actions on that, and I mistakenly said to him, okay, Tim, so if we were going to take a linear route to 2030, what would be your first couple of actions you would take immediately to get there? And he corrected me to say that it isn't linear. It's a hockey stick with a very deep curve at the beginning and then tapering out towards the 2030. Assuming that that is what we need to do within the food system part of it, getting us to 2030 net zero, what would be the actions tomorrow if we got one of our illustrious leaders, such as Prime Minister Boris Johnson or Prime Minister Mario Draghi, to say, right, 2030 net zero is our target, I'm going to be bold, I'm going to grip it, what would be the immediate needs within agriculture the day after he said it?
Well, that's a tough one, because I'm thinking more of a system. So we need to change production, we need to change consumption, and we need to change everything in the middle. But I think when we think about existing carbon sinks, that's really the priority to prevent any further loss of carbon sinks. And that really means an end to growing the agricultural sector, essentially. So one immediate thing would be a peaking of livestock production, which would really send that strong signal and would give us the best assurance of not actually needing to expand agricultural land into pristine habitats and causing further loss of carbon sink. So similarly to what we're thinking about around peak oil and peak carbon, the peak livestock piece, I think, would be a really strong initial commitment that would really send a lot of signals throughout the whole system.
Great. And one of the things we'd have to do for the general getting to carbon neutrality by 2030 would be immediately stop subsidies of fossil fuels and immediately start taxing the polluter and taxing those that were emitting. With methane emissions from agriculture being so huge, would one of those things be putting taxes onto methane emitting large agricultural organisations?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's really about taxing or just about restructuring subsidies for agriculture and actually incentivising different production. Because I think with taxing, there's that option to just continue but at a higher cost. So if the producer and the consumer are willing to pay, and we see this with fuel, for example, so petrol and diesel, if the consumer is willing to pay, the demand will continue or will even rise as GDP and wealth rises. So that's quite a high-risk strategy to rely on taxation. Right. I think it's mostly about restructuring the subsidies and the incentives to actually shift away from those high kind of methane foods.
Right, okay, thank you. And there's obviously an overlap with the biodiversity issues. So, and 2030 target may be the right target for getting down to carbon zero. And currently we're talking about 30% of nature and the seas protected by 2030. How would that overlap with the ideas of changing the food system that we've just been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some important overlap with that 2030 target. So one of them would be to end deforestation, which we've had some commitments to already at this COP. That's a really important one. I think the time frame, though, is something that is concerning. So are we talking about ending deforestation in 2030? Or is this, so from now to 2030, we've actually got a pathway with recognition of those key agricultural commodities that are actually driving deforestation and sort of tackling those issues rather than, again, putting the onus on 9 or 10 years into the future and then stopping when we could have lost way more forest than we currently have. So I think there is overlap, but again, it depends on what the actual detail is.
Yeah. Okay, definitely. Now, coming near the end, Sunniva, and in fact, one of the things that the paper covers a lot is about trying to inspire leadership at all sorts of levels and that sort of thing. I'm delighted that we have two fantastic female leaders up here in different areas and to be inspiring the right kind of leadership, and we probably wouldn't be in the mess we were in if we had female leaders leading many of the countries in the past and leading the efforts we're making on climate change. Maybe you could give us a few comments in the next minute on leadership. And maybe any lessons that came out of your polar expedition on leadership.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's very clear that we need leadership across all arms, and that's all about collaboration. And that's something that we see mostly with females in leadership today, but we see it with you as well, Ed. So this is very important. Leadership up the channel does not work, and we have not seen that be a model for success in today's world. So I think our project Hearts on the Ice was extremely successful because we were all about collaboration across all industries, across boundaries, and it was about supporting each other in our efforts towards a similar goal. And I think that is what we need. We need leadership with heart, compassion, soul, and encouragement for everybody.
Yes, great. Thank you very much for that. Now we come to the end of our presentation today, so thank you to both of our speakers. And I think we have to come to the point as well of recognizing the kind of leadership that we're needing. In relation to our paper that's been brought out, the World Scientists Warning into Action paper, we're looking for more scientists to show leadership all around the world, to engage with their communities and to engage with their local governments and governments at all levels. but we need leadership at this COP26. We have seen a dearth of leadership over the previous COPs. We're on COP26, and we're still trying to solve the same problem we had at COP1, and we have to put it right now. Now, we're on a race, we're on a marathon, and we're trying to break the world record. And we've been training and training and training for it, and that world record is what we've got to do, and that's what we've got to do in terms of carbon emissions. But now we've turned up to the race meeting, and actually we've trained for the marathon, and it's a 10K. Because it's actually got shorter because we've lost a lot of time. So what we need now is our leaders to get up there to run the 10K, not the marathon of 2050, but the 10K of 2030, and get us there safely. This is about the survival of humanity.